Hello, this is Engineering Evolved, and I hope this video makes your day better. Today's presentation is on wireless fading, one of the most important considerations when designing wireless communication systems. This is a very deep topic that is not explored much by most people, but my objective here is to break that down in a way that most people would be able to understand this very topic. To begin with, allow me to break down what fading is. The textbook definition is the variation of the received signal with time or when the position of the transmitting or receiving antenna has changed. To see that visually, here is a diagram. There is the cell tower to the left, there is a car to the right, and at the top there is a sign that determines the location. Any example of fading will incorporate these three characteristics. Now, this is a normal car that has an antenna and most likely has a mobile phone inside. It may be parked or idled or for whatever reason, or it could be moving and traveling in any particular direction. This cell tower is not going to change at all. The same cell tower in New York City will work exactly the same in Japan and anywhere else on the planet. The location, which is what the text above, will indicate what will change. In every model of the wireless communications theory, when first touching the subject, you'll get this big antenna propagating a signal. This signal transverses through the environment, commonly called the medium, and is finally received, albeit weaker, by a receiving antenna, which could be the antenna in the car or the mobile phone. Now, while the purpose of showing you this environment is for you to conceptually understand what is happening on the highest possible level, the medium is always assumed to be ideal and not indicative of a real-world environment. An ideal environment in electrical engineering is to consider room temperature to be 20 degrees Celsius. It is usually the most important factor when talking about an ideal environment. That segue will allow us to talk about flat fading. Flat fading is where the entire signal is modified uniformly without regard to specific frequency. Picture this. You are listening to your favorite Limp Bizkit CD on your speaker, and your friend comes along and turns the volume up or down and nothing more. You notice how the volume is the only thing that changed and not what Limp Bizkit actually sounds like? That is flat fading. The main physical example that is used when describing flat fading is atmospheric ducting. This is where warm air sits above cooler air and creates a special air pocket that bends radio waves and guides them along, instead of letting them scatter normally. We want that scatter. Coastal areas or anywhere with a lot of water are very susceptible to atmospheric ducting. The other major type of flat fading is what's called two-ray propagation. If you are standing in an open, flat, empty field with just you and the cell tower, you may experience this variety of flat fading. Although your cell phone or car antenna has line of sight with the cell tower, the scattering path may ricochet from the ground and reach the antenna array in your cell phone or car antenna to a sufficient strength. Because the extra distance that the reflected path has to travel is quite small, the delay between these two copies are tiny, too small for your phone to separate them by frequency. Instead, these two signals simply add together, sometimes reinforcing each other and sometimes cancelling each other out. The result is still flat fading, but with a very distinctive pattern of peaks and dips as you move around. While ground reflection is the most common example, the two-ray model can also occur in other environments whenever a strong secondary path arrives, only slightly later than the direct path. The key idea is that the delay is small enough that all frequencies in the signal are affected uniformly. The two-ray model itself is just one example of a broader phenomenon called multipath fading. Multipath fading, as the name suggests, occurs when the signal reaches your phone through several different paths. Each path has a different length, so the copies of the signal arrive with different delays and phases. When they combine, they can either reinforce each other or cancel each other out, causing the received signal strength to rise or fall. If the delays between these paths are very small, then all the frequencies in the signal are affected in the same way, hence experiencing flat fading. But if the delays are larger, different frequencies start to add and cancel differently, and you end up with frequency selective fading. A good way to picture this is to think about driving a car. On a perfectly smooth road, the ride is steady, nothing jolts the car, and everything moves together. Even if the road has tiny, evenly spaced bumps, the suspension absorbs them so well that you barely feel anything inside the cabin. That's like flat fading. The whole signal is affected uniformly. But if the road suddenly becomes rough with bumps or different sized scattered at irregular intervals, the suspension can't respond evenly anymore. Some bumps make the car dip, others make it bounce, and the whole ride becomes uneven, and your head would surely become acquainted with the roof of the car. That uneven, unpredictable response is the mechanical equivalent of frequency selective fading. Different components of the signal are being affected differently because the delays between the paths are no longer small. Transmissions between a fast-moving transmitter and receiver can produce frequency selective fading when the motion causes large differences in the path lengths of the reflected signals. Satellite to ground links, communications between moving vehicles, and even everyday cellular use in a dense urban environment like New York City all create situations where multiple strong echoes arrive at noticeably different times. Those delayed reflections interfere unevenly across a signal's bandwidth, and the result is multi-path frequency selective fading. It is extremely important to note that the transmitted frequency can influence what fading you may experience. The frequency selective fading would be more pronounced for certain frequencies if the wavelength was longer and the frequency was smaller, whereas flat fading would be experienced if the frequency was greater and the wavelength shorter. At this point, all of the types and circumstances regarding fading so far have had drastic changes over what would be considered short distances. However, one of the key characteristics of electrical fields is that they can travel through objects depending on the wavelength of said field. Shadowing is another type of fading that causes the signal to lose energy, slowly. There is no sharp drop, but with every reflection, every refraction, and every penetration, there is a tiny amount of absorption. Solutions for the wireless connectivity in New York City are vastly different than somewhere in the Sahara Desert due to how dense New York City is. So while you can stand perfectly still and the ground you stand on will not cause a reflection, and you are within the electrical field's theoretical range, the path that is required to deliver your connection is not ideal and is much weaker because of it. So far I've explained the frequency aspects and the environmental aspects. The next piece, and the one highlighted at the top of the Wikipedia article on fading, is the time aspect. Slow fading versus fast fading. In basic layman terms, this describes how much the channel changes between two signal transmissions, how different the attenuation and delay patterns become from one moment to the next. A simple rule of thumb way to think about this is this. If two sequential signals still look highly similar, around 95% or better, the channel hasn't changed much, and this would be considered slow fading. If that similarity drops noticeably, the channel has shifted too quickly, and that falls into fast fading. This is where the idea of coherence time comes in. It's the interval during which the channel stays in that high similarity state before drifting enough to be considered fast fading. The inverse of coherence time is Doppler spread, which captures how rapidly the channel is changing by measuring the frequency differences created by motion. The classic Doppler example is the pitch of an ambulance siren, rising as it approaches and falling as it moves away. The wave speed stays the same, but the distance the wave travel must change. Wireless signals, being electrical, behave the same way. In practical terms, if you can move several meters or yards before the signal noticeably changes, That's slow fading. But if you're standing still or take a single tiny little step, then the signal suddenly cuts out, that's fast fading. The distance-based sensitivity is tied directly to the signal's wavelength and is one of the key factors engineers use to distinguish slow fading from fast fading. With both coherence time and Doppler spread defined, we now have the tools to describe how stable or unstable a wireless channel is over time. I will give a very brief outline of modeling that engineers use to understand any potential issues from cell tower placement. When there is no clear line of sight and the signal is entirely made out of scattered reflections, the received strength follows what's called Rayleigh fading. If there is a strong line of sight component mixed with those reflections, the distribution shifts into Ricin fading, where the line of sight path gives the signal a more stable anchor. And in more complex or irregular environments, engineers use a flexible model called Nakagami fading, which can mimic both Rayleigh and Ricin behavior depending on the scenario. An important note I want to add here is that these models can apply on a smaller scale, but the engineering community uses these models on a cell tower size scale way more often than any other degree of size. Now to conclude, there will be two more presentations given on fading. The first is a more in-depth explanation of the three mentioned models, as well as a few other mixed in with real-world mitigation solutions. The second presentation is a more math-oriented presentation that will certainly enlighten you and make you wonder why this caveat of knowledge was kept from you before the day of release. I hope this presentation was extremely helpful in your understanding of fading and wireless communication technology. Thank you for your time and have a good day.